If you're going to be building an accessory dwelling unit in your backyard, there's a good chance that you're going to make one of these really common mistakes. I've worked with hundreds of homeowners who are trying to develop a house in their backyard or turn part of their house into another apartment. Almost everybody makes one of the mistakes in this video in our first couple conversations. There's one big misconception that people have. I always hear people say, I thought the city wasn't supposed to charge me fees, or my city passed a great law that says there's no fees under a certain square footage. I've even spoken to mayors and city councilors who think that they've removed all fees from ADUs. And in almost all of these cases, that's actually been untrue. First of all, a lot of the fees that you get charged are not impact fees. Impact fees are a really specific subset of fees. So you will still pay fees to different local agencies when you're permitting and building your ADU. Some impact fees are still charged. So even though the law says you don't have to pay any impact fees under 750 square feet, the school district can still charge you impact fees because it's not governed by the same section of government code that the ADU law affects. So school districts will still charge impact fees, especially for units above 500 square feet. So when I'm working with a new jurisdiction and a client says, I want to know how much I'm going to pay in fees, I will check if the jurisdiction has a fee estimate form or a fee estimate calculator. Sometimes there's just a little free application. It's usually a one-page form. You fill out the rough details of your project and you send it in, and they try to give you a rough ballpark of what kind of fees you'll face. Then you want to look at that output and see, okay, does that include all the types of fees that I would expect with the other steps in this video? The other thing you can check is a fee schedule. So most cities and counties have to publish a fee schedule, which details all the types of fees that the jurisdiction charges. These will not have all the local agencies in them. So for example, you might have different fees from the city planning department and building department, and those are included in the fee schedule. But there might be a fee from a local water corporation or some sort of entity that is outside of the city or county in some respect, and they might not include their fees in the fee schedule. Kind of annoying. But the fee schedule is a good place to start. They're not always very explicit about what kind of fee you'll face for an ADU. So I look for ADU or accessory dwelling unit, I look for secondary unit, all those types of fees and keywords. And then I'll check the fee schedule to see, okay, if that's not there, are there fees related to single family residential or small residential, low density residential? And you kind of read through those fees, and that gives you an idea. If there's a lot of time, each fee gets a line item, and a lot of the fees are like $1 or like $12, and then one fee will be like $12,000. Use your time wisely. So if I'm working for somebody, I'll check for the big fees and go, oh, there's a chance that this $12,000 fee gets applied to this project. Let's ask the city really explicitly about whether that has to do with an ADU or not. People building ADUs don't really care that much if they're going to get charged a $12 sidewalk maintenance fee, but they really care if there's like a 20% chance that they're going to get charged $12,000 for a parklands mitigation impact fee, right? In some cases, especially in rural ADUs where there's massive connection fees for sewer and sanitation, or some very cost prohibitive fee that emerges in our early research, that might be the time where we take a breath and go, we need to figure out this fee situation before we choose to do the ADU or not, because it makes a $40,000 difference. On the other hand, if there's a smaller issue, like, oh, there is a $15,000 fee that we would be able to avoid if we can build under 750 square feet, because it is an impact fee. That's an interesting outcome. If it's like $6,000 to $10,000 in estimated fees, and that really has you like biting your nails, I try to explain to people that's largely within the margin of error on the construction costs of the project, right? From start to finish, you're going to be spending six figures on this accessory dwelling unit. So, the difference between $5,000 in fees and $10,000 in fees is $5,000. That is less than 5% of a six-figure budget. So I wouldn't scuttle the entire project based on a $5,000 uncertainty. That's something you can kind of bite the bullet, move forward. you might get charged something that smells like an impact fee. And I say that because they're not called like impact fee. You don't get a bill that says like impact fee. That would be very convenient, but that's not what they do. You get different charges at different times, and they're usually itemized in really cryptic ways. If a fee ever says impact fee, mitigation fee, those are both good signs that it's an impact fee. Parkland fees, like parks and rec fees, those are very common mitigation impact fees. School fees are a type of impact fee, a mitigation fee, but they are not part of this conversation. You will get charged school fees in almost every situation, unless you build a really small ADU and nothing else. And then I'm always seeing new language that I'm surprised by. So like in my neck of the woods, there is an affordable housing development impact fee, and it's chunky, so it's worth addressing. There's I just saw one the other day. It was called the growth requirement capital fee. Had never seen that language before, but the idea, the word growth appearing in there makes it sound like an impact fee. This is sometimes more art than science. So anytime you see a fee that's called like growth, impact, mitigation, those are all good signs that it's actually a mitigation fee. And if your ADU is above 750 square feet, you should make sure to know how they calculated it so that you know you're paying it proportionally. So what you want to do is ask the city how they calculated that fee. And if the city comes back and they said, oh, it's a flat fee, it's, I think Palo Alto has a flat park fee per district in their town. And some of them are like over $10,000. So if the city just says, oh, it's $10,000 flat fee for any ADU over 750 square feet, then you take that and you forward it to the HCD and you say, I do not believe that they're calculating this proportionally to the size of the ADU over 750 square feet. They are indicating that they are charging a flat fee, or they have broken down the calculation and the calculation seems to multiply the square footage of my entire ADU, not just the square footage above 750 square feet. Or they have calculated it correctly with the ADU's excess square footage, but they do not look at the square footage of my primary house. So it is not proportional to my primary home. And I therefore want some technical assistance because I think I might be overcharged here. Could you weigh in on it? The HCD will look at the math that the city provided you, and they will contact the city and say, hey, we don't know if you should be calculating it this way. Or they'll say, oh, don't know, that's correct. You should pay that. And in either way, and it's a free email. If you feel weird writing that email and like this explanation doesn't make sense to you, I can do that. You just book a call with me on my website, and we can rattle off those emails to the HCD for you, with you. But you still have to work a little on it. You have to give me all the right paperwork. You still have to communicate with the city. So, I try to empower homeowners to do this stuff on their own because you could totally do this. You don't need professional help. I am here if it would make you happy. Mistake number 2. I always hear, oh, the maximum size of my ADU is 1,200 square feet, or the maximum size is 1,000 square feet. And I hear a lot of different maximum sizes, which is already indicative of how funny this mistake is. Because it just depends a lot, not just on the city rules, but also on your lot. There's a specific example that the state of California likes to use. It says you can have an ADU that's 3,000 square feet under these conditions, right? And we'll go through a bunch of the different size restrictions and why this is a common mistake. So in California, there are multiple ways that the state and the city or county have to regulate the size of your ADU. First of all, if it's a conversion of an existing structure, then you're only limited by the size of the existing structure and the building code. This includes tearing down an existing structure and replacing it in a lot of situations. Next, for ADUs that are attached to the existing structure, like the primary home, right? Like you're bumping out an extra wing and turning that into an ADU. In the state rules, these additions or bump outs cannot exceed 50% of the size of the primary home. So if my primary home is 2,000 square feet, I cannot make a 2,000 square foot addition. I am limited to 1,000 square feet. If I have a particularly quaint home, if I have a 1,200 square foot home, I can add up to 600 feet as an addition. I cannot exceed that according to the state rules. Now the city or the county, if you're an unincorporated county, can say, oh, hey, actually you can go past, you can be bigger than that. But the state rules say 50% of the primary. Finally, on detached construction, so it's not the conversion of an existing space, it's not an addition to existing structures, it is a detached new construction, and it is not replacing an existing structure. And these are the most common for my clients. If the city or county has no rule about ADU size, then the maximum square footage is 1,200 square feet, because that's in the state rules. If the county or city want to, they can expand that and say you could build 1,500 square feet, or you could build 2,000 square feet, or they can restrict it more. But the state rules say they can't be more restrictive than a certain floor. So that they can say a 2-bedroom can be no larger than 1,000 square feet. But then there's another layer here where the city or county can also have zoning standards. So your lot has a zoning, and it's something like R1 or low density residential or single family residential, right? And that zone will have a bunch of standards that say, hey, houses can't be more than 4 stories, or houses can't be more than 50% of the lot. You can't cover, you have to have 50% open space on your lot, or rules like that, right? And you can see how some of those rules might limit the size of an ADU. So let's say we have a 4,000 square foot lot. If we have a 1,500 square foot house on that 4,000 square foot lot, and the zoning code says we can only do 50% lot coverage, then the zoning law would be limiting us to a 500 square foot ADU. And it gets more complicated because the state then says, actually, if you're building under 800 square feet, there's a whole, you get to skip all these zoning standards. Any zoning standard that would preclude the construction of an ADU under 800 square feet, as long as it respects the 4-foot setbacks from side and rear lot line, and as long as it's less than 16 feet tall, those zoning standards can't be enforced. That's a statewide exemption ADU, and it is exempt statewide. It gets to avoid a lot of the zoning rules that would normally preclude the construction of an ADU. And so it's even more complicated, right? So when people are really confident about the maximum size of their ADU, I generally have to do a bunch of code research to verify that they're right. And a lot of people who speak to me are very well informed and are right, and that's great. But I'd say more than 50% end up being wrong about the practical application of the size limits on their lot. And that's part of this process, right? If somebody comes to me and says they're trying to create a little extra space for grandma, or they're creating a little starter apartment for their kid who's moving back to California from out of state, it's very easy to then guide people through the size restrictions and say, well, these are the things we can do easily. These are the things we can do with more difficulty or more expense. And let's figure out how to accomplish your goal with the rules that you have in the cheapest, fastest way possible that creates a good lifestyle for the person who's moving in here. If on the other hand, that client's like, actually, Ryan, I need this to be a 1,200 square foot unit because I need it for rental income, and I need it to be 2+ bedrooms, then I can go through it with them, and I say, well, look, this is how you're going to want to proceed. You need to figure out how to get that rental income, and you say the only way you can get it is 1,200 square feet. That means you're going to need to do X, Y, Z, and you got to pick between these different paths. And if at any point the city just says no, then you're going to have to fight the city with this weird rule I found, or you're going to have to try this other path where you combine this one law with this other law, and it gets pretty complicated pretty fast. And it's good to do all this work ahead of time in pencil, when you can erase it, you can change your plan. In some ways, the size limits have been simplified statewide, but in other ways, they still remain very complicated, and it pays to understand how the size limits interact with each other. And before we move on to the next mistake, you could also be in an HOA or some kind of CCR where you've signed away a bunch of rights. Don't even get me started with HOAs. it's a different video, which I've avoided making for 2 years because I do not enjoy HOAs. Bless you if you live in an HOA. It's not for me. Okay, mistake 3. I have an unpermitted ADU. Red flags, red flags. The entire concept of an ADU is kind of a planning invention, right? So my clients tend not to have illegal structures or unpermitted ADUs. My clients have existing structures. And if they appear not to conform to some modern zoning standard, well, then they're non-conforming. They're just non-conformists. They're rebels. Your structure isn't unpermitted because, hey, there was a time in this country where you could build something without a permit. Even today, there are certain types of structures you can build without permits, usually very small ones, and don't at me. So your structure might not have needed a permit when it was built. So it's not unpermitted, it's just existing, and it doesn't conform to today's standards, perhaps. Another way to talk is, before the digital age, not all permits were correctly archived. So maybe your structure was permitted, but the old-timey prospector running the city's planning department didn't archive your permit in 1910. So it's not illegal, it's not unpermitted, it's existing non-conforming, which has a sort of poetry to it. Planners are poets. There are some very specific cases where cities have amnesty programs for existing non-conforming structures, and if that's the case and the city says, oh yeah, you have an ADU, if they are using language like that, then obviously use the language that the city uses. But that's a minority of cases. So just be judicious about the language you use, especially when talking to highly technical people like planners. You want to be specific, and you don't want to get yourself in trouble. So you have an existing structure, you kind of think of it as a guest house, and you want to know what you have to do to bring it up to code as an ADU, or what other options you have. And the planning department and building department will take you through the various steps. Next mistake. People say everybody's allowed to build an ADU. And this is not true. So California passed some laws that make it so that the vast majority of lots that have residential dwellings on them can now build ADUs. Vast majority. But not everybody can build an ADU. And unfortunately, even if it's like, I don't know what the real number is, but maybe it's 1 in 40 can't build. I seem to meet a lot of the ones who they had the wrong expectation going in, and maybe they've already spent some money on plans. Maybe they've taken money out of an investment that it should have been sitting in because they thought like this was an over-the-counter, everybody gets one process. And that's tragically not the case. There are a lot of carve-outs in the ADU law that could mean that you still might not be able to build, and it's worth addressing those before getting too far into the process. There are also some carve-outs that just make it cost prohibitive to build or limit you in ways that make it kind of unappealing. I won't go through everything here, but like water and sewer are a reason that the city can just say no to you. If they've identified that you are in an underserviced area, then they can still reject you. Fire hazard is another sound reason. A city can pass an ordinance that says this whole part of the city does not get ADUs by right. They have to meet certain conditions, or they might have special laws for the very high fire hazard severity zone, which is set by the state. Now, just because you're in a very high fire hazard severity zone doesn't mean your city has said that. So you should look into it and figure out how to make a thoughtful, safe, fireproof home if that's still your intent. But you don't be surprised if there are extra limitations. Condo mapped lots are another thing that come up a lot. If you're in a coastal zone, there's an extra permitting process that you might run into. Again, there are ways to handle this, but it's more complicated. It's not quite as easy. Lots without a primary house, that comes up constantly. And you gotta propose a primary house and the ADU at the same time, or build a primary house and then propose the ADU. If you're in flood zones, it can be pretty cost prohibitive to figure out how to raise your ADU enough. It's a separate permit that is less ministerial, harder to get. You could be near a creek. Creeks can be real project killers. You might be on a soil type or a slope that make it really cost prohibitive to build. There are lots of things that can just drive a project cost so high that becomes a barrier too. In some places, like in San Francisco, houses that share walls with their neighbors, and if you want to build in the backyard, you need to create a really special access point for the backyard house to be able to evacuate, for firefighters or tradespeople to be able to access the backyard without going through the front house or going through a garage. There are also lots of ways that you can kind of give up your right to build ADUs by right. So for example, HOAs can't completely prohibit ADUs, but they can put a lot of requirements on them. And you've decided to live in an HOA, and so you are subject to the rules. Again, we can get into the details of how you negotiate with your HOA. You may have given up some ADU privileges. You could be a participant in the Williamson Act. I see this a lot on ag land, where people get a big tax break from the Williamson Act, and that might be interpreted by the county as saying that you won't build an accessory dwelling unit because that would infringe on the agricultural use. Again, that could be negotiated sometimes. Some counties want one way, some counties want the other way. But it could mean that you've given up that right. You could already have built something that precludes an ADU. So if you've used SB9 to do a lot split and build an SB9 second unit. So there's lots of things you could do to give up some of your ADU privileges. There's like lots of things that can happen that make a project not feasible, that make a project impractical, or that make it so that you've given up your privilege to do a project ministerially. Lots of stuff happens. So, when people see that there's like dozens of videos on this channel, and I'll go into a fair amount of detail about real projects, you get why. You get why. All right. And then lastly, people say, I'm going to save a ton of money by going owner builder. And what I'm going to say is you will save some money, maybe, by going owner builder, and you will invest a lot of time. Instead of hiring a general contractor who's going to manage the project and assume all the liability and put their license on the permit, the homeowner gets a permit as an owner builder and hires licensed subcontractors and manages them themselves, and or does some of the work themselves because they're handy. I don't know why I just showed myself. I'm not handy. Not going to be an owner builder. In my Facebook group, How to ADU, people complete projects as owner builders. It seems every week somebody's finished a project. I will set some expectations about what that process will feel like and some of the things that you'll hit in there that could make the difference between saving a lot of money and you save some money, but you spend a lot of time, and then in the worst case, you didn't save money. You lost a bunch of money, or you took 9 months longer than you should have, and you didn't get to rent out a unit for 9 months, and so you really spent way more to save a little bit. But that is here. Let's set expectations so that you do not fall into that last camp and end up surprised. First of all, I would say that you're gonna make some mistakes. If you've ever built anything, even done a small DIY project, you probably know that the first one you do doesn't turn out exactly like you think it will. And even if you do a great job, you often learn something during the process where you're like, well, I wouldn't do it that way again. Next time I'll do this, I'll buy this other material, or I'll line this order up beforehand. There's lots of things you learn. Building a house is a complicated process, and you will be learning a bunch of stuff because you're building your first one, and if you're okay with that learning process, then that's great. But if you are surprised that it is not more streamlined or easier, then that you will be perpetually surprised throughout this process. And you should build in all that savings you plan on banking. You should assume that you might end up having to spend it all on some mistakes. And if you get to the end and you haven't spent it all and you saved $10,000, that's amazing, right? Or $40,000 in East Bay rates, right? It's very conceivable. That would be great. But if you ended up saving less and reinvesting that $40,000 to fix some mistakes, that's life. But you've learned something, and maybe that was worth it for you. And I talk to a lot of people who say, don't worry, Ryan, I'm just going to be acting like a GC. I'm going to sub everything out to licensed contractors, and I just want to save the general contractor margin. which, is like 20% or something. So 20% of a $200,000 project, that's a lot of money. So I get the impetus. I just want to like put something out there. GCs do a couple things that are important. One of them is that they manage multiple professional tradespeople who are kind of siloed and kind of responsible for just their own piece of the pie of the house. It's not a pie. Pie is a terrible metaphor here. It is very common for an inspector to come into a project and say, oh, you need to redo this. This was framed up wrong. I need you to change the type of brackets you have on this part of the framing. And you go back to the framer and you're like, hey, the inspector says that it's done wrong. Can you redo it? And the framer goes, I had to do it that way because the guy before me did this other thing this way. You go back to that guy and that guy's like, well, I had to do it that way because that's what makes sense given the thing that we're doing here. Technical details that you don't understand because it's the first time you're building a house. That blame game often goes all the way back to like, well, the plans said to do this, or like, you don't know what you're talking about, or the building inspector doesn't know what they're talking about. And I guess I'm just saying that when stuff comes up, and it does, it's always nobody's fault, and you're on the hook for it. And that's kind of what a general contractor does as a manager in that situation. And sometimes the general contractor eats it. Sometimes the general contractor gets one of the subs to say, yeah, that was, I can see how that was my thing. And the GC is going to be better at that because they have more technical knowledge and they have an ongoing relationship with all these subs, whereas you're like a one and done. So the subs don't really have to treat you as well as they treat a general contractor. So I would expect to eat it a few times, put in some change orders. Another thing that happens really commonly is one team gets delayed by another team, or right now there's a lot of supply chain disruptions. So you didn't order the window in time, so we can't do this next part until the window's here. And that means we have to reschedule this team for another month. And like, maybe there's some costs there. And it's just kind of like, you're the manager. You're the one responsible for that. If you hire a GC, you are paying them dearly to manage that process and be on the hook. When you take on the role yourself, you do not have anybody to turn to but yourself when there's a delay, and that's part of the game, right? And that's one of the reasons why you're going to be saving a lot of money if you steer through this process successfully. The margins are so big these days that a lot of people are going to hear everything I just said, go, that's very reasonable, and I'm still going to do it, and that's fine. Like, as long as you know what you're getting in for, then I think then you have a better chance to succeed. Now, this video is going to have 6 more mistakes that people make. I know, there's a lot of mistakes, right? When they're planning their ADUs. Check it out. I'll walk through Symbium software to show you how to figure it out for your own property. And if you ever get nervous, just book a call. Go to my website. I forget if it's in this corner or this corner. A lot of the time, it just takes one hour phone call to set you on the right track to building your ADU. That was a long one.